Okay, so having talked about that, I just want to talk about one other aspect of slavery in Texas during the Texas Revolution, and it's whether or not the question of whether or not slavery would be allowed to continue from Africa. In the U.S. in 1808, slavery, the slave trade from Africa had been abolished. Now, some of you might remember that from your US history courses. And the reason for that, it wasn't humanity really. The reason for that is that it was part of the deal when the Constitution was written, that 20 years after it was ratified, the slave trade from Africa would be ended. But the reason that Southern slaveholders went along with that is that they had this enormous surplus of slaves, which they could then sell to what became Southern states like Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. So Southern slaveholders are actually pretty okay in the Upper South, where there's a surplus of slaves, especially Virginia, the Carolinas. They're okay with the law banning the slave trade from Africa, because what it does is it's a supply and demand, right? The cost of their slaves goes up much higher, increases, because suddenly now there's no competition from Africa. So the other thing that's happening at this time is there's a real global desire to stop the slave trade from Africa, led by Great Britain. And the slave trade, as you know, was unbelievably inhumane. It was kind of a crime against humanity that is really almost unbearable to read about or think about, although we have to read about it or think about it because it happened and it affected tens of millions of lives. And it reshaped the globe, it reshaped Africa, it reshaped the Western Hemisphere. But there was a reaction among powerful countries against the slave trade. And the only reason that Texas cared about that is that Texas hoped to sell its cotton to Great Britain. And Great Britain was one of the leading powers against the African slave trade. So again, remember, Texans are full-throated slave proponents, okay? They are completely behind slavery. But on the question of the importation of slaves from Africa, there are some arguments because some Texans are saying to other Texans, look, we don't need slaves from Africa because we can just buy slaves from from Louisiana, or there's lots of slaves nearby. But what's interesting is that Texans had started in the early 1830s, including James Fannin, and we're going to run into James Fannin again because he was the really poor general at Goliad, who basically lost Goliad and had all his men massacred at Goliad. In the early 1830s, James Fannin was actually going to Havana, where a lot of African slave trades by this time. Havana was the center of the slave trade in the New World. Another center was Brazil. But in the Northern Hemisphere, the northern part of the Western Hemisphere, Havana was the center of the slave trade. And the people like Fannin and other farmers were going to Havana and purchasing slaves in Havana that had been transported from Africa and bringing them directly into Texas. We think that by 1836, about 1,000 slaves that had been sent directly from Africa to Havana were purchased by Texas plantation owners and brought into Texas. Now remember, Texas at this point is not under US law. So the Texans aren't breaking US law, but of course they're breaking Spanish law, right? Because the Spanish had tried to crack down on the importation of slaves into Texas. So long story short, what you have is in the 1830s, you start having the direct importation of slaves from Africa into Texas via Havana. And James Fannin, one of the major figures and one of the, how can I put it? He just was an awful, awful commander. And on top of that, he was a slave smuggler. He is involved in this slave trade. So if you're from Houston, or you've been to Houston, I'm sure you've been down Fannin Street. And next time you're here, you might, or if you're ever driving down Fannin Street, just remember this guy Fannin was smuggling slaves from Africa via Cuba into Texas. Not a very savory story. So what happens is that there's a fight among the governing body, the Texas Revolutionary governing body, about whether or not slaves should be allowed to be introduced from Havana, from Cuba, but it gets disrupted by the Texas Revolution, and it's settled in the period after the Texas Revolution, and I'll talk about it more then. Now, what's going to happen now in the podcast? I'm going to go to the earlier set of podcasts and start building up what the circumstances of the Texas Revolution, beginning with the 1835, when Santa Anna stages a coup and he gains control over the Mexican government. And again, the big picture here is that when Santa Anna seizes power, General Santa Anna, in 1835, what you have is the centralists in Mexico have the upper hand, and they try to crush the federalists. Not only in Texas, but in the Yucatan and Zacatecas, there's rebellions against Santa Anna all over Mexico. Texas is just one aspect of the federalist rebellions against Santa Anna. But what makes Texas unique was, of course, that it was that there were slaves here, and that it bordered the U.S. So the big point is, you can't understand the Texas Revolution without having some understanding of Mexican history.